Scholarship dates the Book of Acts anywhere between the 60s and the 150s of the Common Era. Recently, Carl Leslie Armstrong has asserted or reasserted an early dating of Acts to approximately 62 to 63 of the Common Era. Some of his arguments are invalid, such as the appeal to a putative scholarly consensus that the majority of scholars view Acts in varying degrees as a historical document. But a historical document can, of course, be mixed with a host of fictional elements demanded by the creation of a narrative. If it is true of modern history, it is all the more true of what the ancients called historia. Armstrong's argument is, moreover, beside the point, because even if there were a consensus that everything in Acts was historical, it would not determine when it was composed. In essence, Armstrong restates the patristic position that, quote, Luke is the author of Luke and Acts, and was, in some capacity, a companion of the Apostle Paul. He leans heavily on source criticism, but his imagined sources are speculative and unproven. They include things like memory and oral traditions. The proof of such traditions is the use of we in several passages of Acts. Armstrong believes that the simplest explanation is that the author of these passages was a companion of Paul, though, of course, this would not necessarily be Luke. Armstrong's simple solution is in reality simplistic, given what we know of ancient historiographical conventions. Authors who wanted to appear as an eyewitness could use the first person to increase the reality effect of their discourse. Thus, it's no surprise that the author of Acts sporadically used the first person plural pronoun we, and depicted himself as an eyewitness in the preface to the Gospel according to Luke. These rhetorical stances do not reliably indicate the date of a document. The author never claims to have used notes or an itinerary or a diary from Antioch or elsewhere. Theories about such sources are speculative and lead to false problems, such as how this character, Luke, saved his notes as he swam ashore from the shipwreck he described in Acts 27:44. The point where the author of Acts chose to end his narrative is also not an indication of the text's date. A historian can end a work anywhere he or she pleases, regardless of modern sensibilities about what counts as complete or relevant in a history. Armstrong's attempt to follow the quote-unquote simple solution observed by the ancient writers that Luke only wrote what he was aware of is, once again, simplistic. Armstrong is also inaccurate in this judgment. As he himself points out, the patristic writer John Chrysostom in the 4th century knew that the author of Acts focused on what was of immediate importance to his rhetorical and literary goals. Events such as the fire in Rome in 64 and the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 were evidently not of immediate importance for the author of Acts to complete his history. Even though the author likely knew these events, as we can see from Luke 13:35 and 19:43 to 44, he created a kind of cliffhanger with Paul under house arrest preaching the gospel unhindered at Rome. If he were to report everything, the author of Acts would, as Chrysostom observed, make the reader dull and jaded. Yet Armstrong urges that no credible historian, whether ancient or modern, much less the first Christian historian, could invent such an ending to Acts if these events, such as the fire in Rome or Paul's trial under Nero or the destruction of Jerusalem, had already passed. If the author was writing in the 2nd century, however, his omission of Paul's death makes sense, since 2 Timothy and 1 Clement covered this topic. Tacitus and Suetonius treated mother-killing Nero, and Josephus related the temple's destruction since he was an eyewitness. The fact that quote-unquote Western variants of Acts, which expand the text, do not substantively change its ending shows that ancient Christians did not share Armstrong's assumptions about what Acts written after 64 should or should not have included. In sum, Armstrong operates under a fallacy. Because an author did not mention key events that happened later in the narrative time of writing, one can use the narrative time of writing to determine its composition in historical time. But this argument is rather like saying that a historian of the American Civil War, writing in 1965, because she did not or he did not mention any of the key events regarding Lincoln's death and Sherman's burning of Atlanta, must have written prior to 1864. Despite Armstrong's rhetorical pleas to represent the irrational and consistent position, his argument fails to persuade. One can, however, agree with Armstrong, who, on this score, repeats Richard Pervo, that the dating of Acts to the late 1st century, between 80 and 95, is little more than a political compromise. It makes sense that Acts would, with Luke, be dated after the destruction of the temple referred to in Luke 13:35, "Your house is abandoned," and 1943 to 44, referring to the Roman fortifications and siege of Jerusalem. Yet nothing demands that the upper limit be set between 80 and 95, apart from the inference that the author was Paul's traveling companion. That inference, however, is unsound, since the author of Acts never said he knew Paul personally. The use of the first person plural and the deployment of supposedly vivid historical details can be explained by the techniques of narrative fiction and the possible uses of sources closer in time to Paul. What then is the evidence of a later, post-95 dating of the book of Acts? First of all, the author or editor of Luke Acts seems to have used Josephus, and in particular the latter books of the Antiquities, which date to about 93 of the Common Era. Indications of dependence are rife, though I will only note 3. Please see my other video on dating Acts for more details. First of all, Acts presents Gamliel mentioning Theudas and Judas the Galilean as rebels in the same non-chronological order as Josephus, along with the same connection between Judas and the census in Acts 5:36 and 37. Secondly, the author of Acts combines the Sicarii, mentioned as urban assassins in Josephus, with a figure known as the Egyptian, who also appears in Acts 21:38. Now, these Sicarii are historically unrelated to the Egyptian, are both mentioned in the very same context with the same names by Josephus as they are in Acts. By melding two distinct but juxtaposed reports in Josephus, evidently, the author of Acts mistakenly presented the Egyptian as leader of the Sicarii. Finally, the author of Acts borrowed details from Josephus about the death of Herod Agrippa I. In this passage, the king publicly appears in Caesarea wearing a royal garb, Acts 12:20-23. In response to people proclaiming his divinity, the king acquiesces to the praise and meets a sudden demise. All these events are, in combination, reported nowhere else but in Josephus and Acts. An appeal to unknown and speculative sources such as oral tradition cannot trump what we actually know from surviving accounts. Accordingly, Acts is best dated sometime after 93. Another indication of date is the author's use of a Pauline letter collection. The story of Paul's escape from Antioch in Acts 9:25 borrows language from 2 Corinthians 11:33. 2 Corinthians provides the reason why Paul had to escape from Antioch, a reason apparently assumed in Acts. From the same chapter in 2 Corinthians 11:25, the author of Acts presented data that Paul was stoned, as we see in Acts 14:19-20, and shipwrecked in 27:44. Acts probably takes its portrait of Paul the persecutor from Galatians 1:13, borrowing the distinctive Greek verb portheo, meaning destroy, and the distinctive collocation of being a zealot, zelitos huparkon, in Galatians 1:14, a phrase also appearing in Acts 22:3. Key phrases also appear from Ephesians, such as preaching peace in Ephesians 2:17 and Acts 10:36, and the phrase with all humility in Ephesians 4:2 and Acts 20:19. From Romans, there is also the thematic and verbal overlap that God is not a receiver of faces, using the distinctive Greek word prosopolemptes in Acts 10:34 from Romans 2:11, as well as the distinctive phrase boiling in spirit, to pneumatizeo, in Romans 12:11, adapted in Acts 18:25. Acts' extensive borrowing from 1 Thessalonians have been documented elsewhere. If the author of Acts knew 1 Thessalonians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and Romans, he was probably using a Pauline letter collection, a collection that at its earliest appeared at the end of the first century of the Common Era. Probably the collection that Acts employed was later, however, since canonical 2 Corinthians is not attested before 120 CE. Again, see my earlier video on dating Acts, as well as the notes to this video for bibliography. The author of Acts reported that Jesus' devotees were first called Christians, Christiani, in Antioch, Acts 11:26. The name Christiani is not attested prior to Ignatius, who was from Antioch. The earliest dating of Ignatius is about 110 of the Common Era, yet recent and revised datings put him in the 130s or 140s. According to Andrew Gregory, there's no secure evidence to prove the use of Acts until Irenaeus, about 180. A later dating is supported by arguments which contextualize Luke Acts as a response to Marcion, who flourished in the 130s and 140s. The evidence as a whole inclines me to date the book of Acts between 120 and 150. This would make Acts contemporary with the writing of the Simonian Great Declaration. As I point out in my book, Simon of Samaria, the author of Acts seems to be familiar with traditions that post-date the declaration, for instance, the idea of Simon as the great power. In my book, I address the question of whether the author of Acts knew the declaration itself, and I also provide an exposition of Acts 8:9-24. For now, I want to thank all of you for listening to this presentation. If you've benefited in any way, please consider supporting me on Patreon or by subscribing to my blog, which you can find at mdavidletwa.com. Thank you and take care.